The Eat Like Ruby podcast is not a substitute for professional medical or dietary advice. The advice given in this episode is general in nature and should not be used to treat any medical conditions, health conditions, illnesses, injuries, and or any nutrition-related conditions, deficiencies, or similar. This podcast is not to be used as or in place of medical advice or dietary advice. Please consult your healthcare professional before implementing any of the advice, information, or protocols discussed in this episode. Hello guys, welcome to the Eat Like Ruby podcast. I'm your host Ruby Fraser, accredited sports nutritionist, personal trainer, online coach, obsessed with all things nutrition and training, education, mindset, chat, and I am here today to do just that. So welcome if you are a first-time listener, welcome back if you're a long-term listener. I love having all of you here. And I am here today to do a two-parter episode. So I'm going to speak about a really cool topic, I think. I think this is awesome. And I think there's a lot of things to cover here. I'm going to look at sort of the factual, sciencey side of this, if you will. And then also, like I always want to just bring it back to what does this mean for me as an everyday person that wants to be in shape, get after it with nutrition and training, etc. So what I'm going to speak about today, the first thing I'm going to say is, before I tell you what I'm speaking about, do not leave when you hear what I'm going to speak about. I think there's going to be people who hear the first sentence and go, I don't care about that. I'm out of here. Please do not leave in the next 2 minutes, regardless, because I really, really need to explain something here that I think would be so beneficial for so many people. And what I'm talking about is the topic of today's episode and the next one that's going to drop straight after this is basically, do I need a surplus to gain muscle? Do I need to go into a calorie surplus to gain muscle? And I am going to cover that actual question, but I'm also going to cover actually how muscle gain is achieved, what happens in the body when we gain muscle. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to talk about today that we've never gotten into before. I've always sort of briefly touched on like why we train and what's happening when we're training and how muscle growth occurs from training, but I'm going to look at the nutrition side of it today and just like actually what's happening in the body, because I think there's so many girls, I think there's so many gym girls who are keen to build their shape and work on their training and build their rig and all of the things I talk about, which is absolutely unreal. You guys know I am fully here for that. Like I can't even put into words how much I love seeing girls do this. So I think we have the gym girls that are keen to do this, but I think there's always that little underlying thing, especially when we're doing it for the first time. We're maybe a little bit hesitant, we're a little bit apprehensive. Like I always say, the thought of going into like a quote muscle gain phase or focusing on gaining muscle, that's usually so foreign to females when we think about just usual dieting history. Not a lot of us have spent a lot of the time being like, I'd like to gain. So I think there's always a bit of hesitation, apprehensive, bit nervous, a little bit scared. And then we come to that question of like, so shit, do I actually need to go into a full-blown calorie surplus to gain muscle? We're going to cover that today and in the next episode. And the reason I said don't leave is because, like, don't leave if you hear the term gain muscle and think you've got no interest in that. If you are new here, I would go back and listen to episode 123, How to Tone Up, because if we don't know, if you're a regular listener or you've got a bit of understanding of all this stuff, you probably know that when we're looking at someone toning up, a big part of that is putting on a little bit of muscle. And so if you're someone who heard the term like gain muscle or anything to do with that and thinks, no way, I don't want to gain muscle, I don't want to bulk up, etc., we want to bring that back and go, but do I want to tone up? Do I have a goal to be more toned and be more lean? Most people that are going to gym do have this goal. If we think about anyone going to gym and using a machine, whether that's like an arm machine, a leg machine, or even doing things like sit-ups, most people are doing that. Most females are doing that in the mentality of like, I would like to tone up this body part. Make sure you understand the fact that toning up a body part requires putting some muscle onto that body part. If you want to tone up your whole body, it's putting on muscle in general. So if you don't understand that, I would definitely go back and listen to episode 123. You could listen to that and then come back to this one, or you could listen today and then go back and go, oh, I do have the goal to tone up. I need to make sure I listen to that one too. But don't let the term like muscle gain throw you off, because I'm not talking about like bulking up into a full-blown bodybuilder, Arnold Schwarzenegger style. I'm talking about why are we training? Like if you're going to the gym and working a certain body part and doing resistance training on that body part, I would say there's an underlying thing there, or maybe it's not even underlying, but there's a thing there where you're like, well, I want this body part to appear more toned or be more toned or similar to that, and understand that that comes from muscle gain. Today, we're going to talk about how muscle gain actually occurs. And then I think, like I said, I think there's people that do understand that whole toning thing and they know they want to build a little bit and they're cool with that. But then they're sort of like, what does this actually mean for nutrition? Do I have to bulk up? Like, where do I go from there? So I think this is going to be a wicked combo. It is going to be the two-parter. And I'm literally just going to kind of hit a point halfway through the convo where I go, okay, now we're splitting it in half and I'm going to deliver the rest in the next episode, just because she's got a lot of notes. And we all know I love to talk. Got a lot of notes. There's a lot of like factual stuff that I want to explain here. This is why I've got the notes. And then, like I said at the start, I always love to explain the facts because we know education is my number one thing. I want you guys to actually really understand what's happening when you're training. Think about a person going into the gym to train. You want to know why, and not just like, oh, because they want to lose weight or tone up. You want to actually be able to piece together, I have a goal to achieve XYZ, so I go to the gym this amount of times, do these amount of reps on these machines because it leads to this process happening in my body, which leads to this outcome, which gets me to my goal. You want to actually know this stuff and understand this stuff if you're going to go to the effort of implementing it. So I love to deliver the education and the facts, but then I think if we just kind of sit here and talk like all sciencey, I'm not going to go too sciencey today, but there is going to be a little bit. But then I'm always going to bring that over and go, okay, cool. If I'm a gym gal who either wants to tone up, lose a bit of weight, just look better, make sure I'm getting the most out of my time in the gym, what does all this actually mean? So that's what we're going to do today and in the next episode. And I think this is going to be really beneficial. I think this is a big education episode. And I'm pumped to be doing it. I'm pumped to be bringing it. And like I touched on there, guys, I am going to speak about a few things we've never spoken about before. So you might have heard these elsewhere. You might have never heard them, but I think we could risk a little bit of info overload today. And the thing I just want to say with that is, like, let that be okay. If you're learning something for the first time and you're kind of hearing it and you're thinking, oh my God, what does she mean by that? And you're skipping back. What did she just say there? How does that piece together? That's totally fine. That's like anything in life. Usually we've kind of got to go through it and hear it a few times maybe to actually let it all sink in. So if you feel a little bit overloaded or overwhelmed throughout this episode, it makes sense. But I would absolutely advise just re-listening, coming back to it and just letting it all sink in. Because I think lately we've been kind of getting into topics where it can leave someone in a position of either going, oh my God, there's still so much I don't know and there's still so much I have to work on. And we can like see that as a negative thing, like, oh my God, I've got so far to go. Or I think we need to like realize we can look at that and go, oh my God, there's still like so much cool shit I can do and work on and implement, which is really cool because most of us are still trying to work towards something. Even if you've achieved wicked results with your nutrition training, you're probably still trying to work towards something else. So it's actually cool that you're getting new information because that's the shit that's going to take you to the new levels. So don't let the overwhelm be a negative thing. Just be like, oh my God, there's so much juice here. I'm going to have to listen to this a few times. And when I start to get my head around this, I'm going to be a bad bitch in the gym. So I'm going to get into it. And one of the first things I want to say, which might be a little bit frustrating, but I promise you guys, I am going to break this down so much in this episode. And I think probably even more in the next one. I think this is where our part 2 will come in. But the question of, do I need to go into a calorie surplus to gain muscle? There's no exact answer. I'm not going to sit here. You're not going to listen to this episode and go, so here's your definite answer and here's exactly what you should do. I've definitely got some recommendations. Again, I think that's more of the part 2 chat of what I would do if you're sitting there. If you take all this in and go, okay, cool, where to from here? What do I do with this information? I'm definitely going to give you some recommendations there, but it's not a definitive, yes, we need to be in a surplus. No, we do not. There's so many factors that are going to come into this. And that's why I want to do these episodes and actually explain this stuff so you can understand that it's not just a simple yes or no. There's a few things to think about. And when you know those things, you can think about them. So it might be a little bit frustrating because I think sometimes people are like, Ropes, just give me the answer. But I like to give the education so that you can come to the answer yourself, depending on how all of that information actually applies to you. So in this first episode, I really want to look at the facts, and there's a few sort of key points in the facts of muscle growth and what's happening when we gain muscle. And there's obviously a lot of research, a lot of things we could look at here. I'm going to try and sort of keep it as simple as I can while giving you the information that you need. Obviously, there are people out there that like literally live for this shit, and there's endless studies and there's so much that we could like really deep dive into. But this is almost like a bit of a summary of the information that we really want to understand. And then we're going to go from there. So there's a few things when we look at the question of, do I need a calorie surplus to gain muscle? There's a few things that we know negatively impact muscle growth. And I'm going to kind of rattle those off now, and then we're going to look at some stuff and we're going to come back to them. So this is where our information overload is probably going to start. But there's a few things that we know negatively impact muscle growth. And that doesn't answer the question of like, do I need a surplus? But when we understand these things, or when we look at these things and then we break down the process, we can kind of start to rebuild and piece it all together. So the things that we know can negatively impact muscle growth is a lack of protein. Having inadequate or insufficient protein come in. And we've touched on protein a lot before. We know that that optimal range is about 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight. I'm not going to get too much into that today because we've spoken about that so much before, but a lack of quality and quantity protein coming in can negatively impact muscle gain. So that's something that we want to think about. The next one is like, sounds a little bit complicated or a little bit like what, but really it's actually quite simple. But what it is a reduction in motor unit recruitment and or mechanical tension. And that probably sounds a bit confusing, but basically that just means like insufficient training, not hard enough training, or not training hard enough. If we think about like motor unit recruitment, that's such a mouthful to say, and mechanical tension, that's really like the body working through training. So if we are looking at the things that negatively impact muscle growth, it makes sense that like if we didn't have really sort of good quality, like hard pushing training hard in place, obviously that's going to negatively impact muscle growth a little bit. And the last sort of main thing that we look at that can negatively impact muscle growth is a lack of energy required to make new functional proteins. And that can sound confusing, and this is something that I want to explain, and it might be something you have to listen to a few times. We talk so much about protein in the form of consuming protein, like the protein in our food, consuming it and having it come into the body. But then we also use the term proteins, or we have protein in the body, and we talk about the term muscle proteins, and we're going to talk about this heaps today. Muscle proteins are the primary building blocks of muscle tissue. So that could get a little bit confusing if you're so used to just hearing that term protein and thinking about it as like, oh, protein is in food. Yes, it is. But then protein is also, like I said, the primary building blocks in the body. And if we're looking at muscle, which is obviously what we're looking at today, it is like a primary building block of muscle tissue. And I'm going to literally read out the notes I had on this because this is one of the main reasons I wanted to bring notes, so that I don't talk in circles or get too confusing for people. So I've got here literally in my notes, what is muscle protein? Something to understand here. We speak about protein so much as the protein in our food, but we need to understand that muscle proteins are the primary building blocks of muscle tissue, crucial for muscle structure, function, and overall body movement, with key proteins playing a vital role in muscle contraction. And then a few dot points I had on that, which are not things that we like really need to understand on a deeper level, but might just help some people piece it together. Muscle proteins are the main components of contractile units of muscle tissue. These proteins work together to enable muscle contraction and relaxation, allowing for movement and other body functions. Muscle proteins are also important for the structure and texture of meat and meat products. Muscle proteins are a major component of muscle tissue, making up about 20% of the total muscle weight. And like I said, we don't need to really understand all of those points, but the main thing I want people to understand about this is, because we're going to get a bit more into this muscle protein chat, we're going to use that term protein a lot today, and muscle proteins especially, and we just want to make sure we kind of understand, and you might not fully get it yet, but you just have been able to differentiate between when we talk about like eating protein versus what we're talking about now, like once that protein is in the body and it has started to form the building blocks of the muscle tissue. And like I said, it forms building blocks of so many things in the body, but today we're going to really look at the muscle, obviously. Otherwise, we'll be even more confused and we'll be here even longer. And if we bring that back to those 3 key points I was saying that we know negatively impact muscle growth, we had the first one was lack of protein. So that even almost kind of starts to make sense. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. But if we think about the fact that muscle protein is the building block or like a main component of muscle mass in the body, if we think about getting insufficient protein in the first place, obviously then that's going to have a flow-on effect to actually building that muscle. And I'm going to explain that a lot more in a second. But that was the first one. The other one was essentially the reduction in training intensity. And then that final one was lack of energy required to make new functional proteins. So again, I'm going to explain this a little bit more in a second, but if we really think about the 2 things that are coming up there that are cock-blocking muscle growth, essentially, it's like if we're not training hard enough and if we're not getting enough protein in and letting the protein do its thing in the body. So those are the things that we want to be a little bit aware of. And there's obviously other things, I'll come to that in a second, but those are the main things we want to clock. Like, okay, if I'm someone who's wanting to build a bit of muscle, these are the things that are showing are stopping that or hindering that. So we want to be aware of that overall concept, and then I'm going to break those concepts down a little bit more now. What I just said there was there can be other things that obviously affect our ability to gain muscle, but usually it's a bit of a flow-on effect from those original points, because sometimes we look at things like, you know, a person who's maybe getting poor sleep or they're stressed or anything like that, then they're struggling to achieve their body composition goals. But usually we can kind of piece that together and go, okay, well, if a person is stressed and having poor sleep, that could be leading to poor quality of training. If we look at one of those 3 things we just flagged that's stopping muscle growth, it was shitty training intensity. So even though we sit there and go, oh, like sleep can impact muscle growth or stress can and all of that, usually we can link them back to those main points. Not always, but they're sort of the main things that we want to be aware of. And if we just stop for a sec before I move on to the next thing, even if we look at that question of like, do I need a surplus to gain muscle? None of those points I just said actually indicates that, yes, we need a surplus of calories coming in to gain muscle. We might still need one. I'm going to get to that. But if we look at those 3 things that are stopping muscle gain, it's not like a calorie surplus would solve those problems. It might help. We'll get to that in a sec. But that's where, like I said at the start, there's no definite yes or no, we need one. There's other things we want to look at and understand to then get to the point of like, okay, cool. So knowing everything I know now, should I have a bit of a surplus in place? Should I not? So just keep all of that in mind. Listen to it again if you need to, because it was probably a little bit of info overload. But if we move on to looking at how muscle gain actually occurs and like what we need to gain muscle, what we need to be happening in the body to gain muscle. And I think the best way for me to explain this is to read out my notes and then I can kind of riff on the notes. So I've got 3 key things I want to talk about here. And the first one is muscle hypertrophy. Some people say hypertrophy, but however you want to say it. And the notes I've got on this is the process of your body building new muscle or increasing muscle mass is called muscle hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy refers to the increase in the size of skeletal muscle fibers through a growth in the size of their component cells. Muscle hypertrophy typically occurs as a result of strength training, such as weightlifting, which causes microscopic tears in the muscle fibers. If we just side note on that for a second, we've spoken about that a lot in our training episodes, where the point of training is to push the body to the point of adaptation, break down the muscle fibers, essentially have those muscle fibers go, shit, that was hard. I need to be a bit bigger, better, stronger to handle this next time you ask me to do it. That right there is what we just spoke about. Muscle hypertrophy refers to the increase in the size of skeletal muscle fibers. And then that second thing I said was, it typically occurs as a result of strength training, which causes microscopic tears in these muscle fibers. So piece that together with the info we have spoken about earlier this year, where, like I said, the point of training is we push to that point, they break down and then they grow back, increase the size of those skeletal muscle fibers, aka the muscle starts to grow. So back to the notes. During recovery, the body repairs these damaged fibers, and in doing so, it adds more protein and muscle tissue, leading to an increase in muscle mass and strength. Again, I'm going to side note, and we're going to keep talking about this a lot more in a second, but we can just start to kind of clock it and piece it together. If we look at that, during recovery, the body repairs these damaged fibers, And in doing so, it adds more protein and muscle tissue, leading to an increase in muscle mass and strength. So the body is adding more protein into that muscle. So that's just what I want people to clock there, and we'll explain that a little bit more in a second. Then if we look at sort of factors that can contribute to this or influence it, resistance training, obviously we want to push the body to actually break down those muscle fibers in the first place. Nutrition is obviously a big factor because we want to make sure we're getting that protein into those muscles, and we also want to make sure we're getting enough energy in overall, which is something I'm going to speak about soon. But if we think about the muscle having gone through that tearing stage or tearing those muscle fibers, and then it's starting to go through that rebuild and repair, it wants the protein to do so, but it also wants enough energy to do so, because the body uses energy for a lot of things. So if we haven't given it enough, it might not use it towards that, is something that I want to clock there. And that's what we'll come back to in a second. And that's where we could even start to go, oh, so making sure there's enough energy, aka maintenance or a surplus, could be a real key factor here. If the body is looking for energy and protein to help it in that building process after we've trained, we want to make sure it's got enough. Clock that. Another thing is rest. So allowing your body sufficient time to recover is obviously super important. If we think about that process that it's going through, it's breaking down, we're fueling it to rebuild and repair. We want to actually let it do that. We don't want to intercept it with too much training and too many other things while it's in that process. And if you're a long-term listener, we've spoken about this in so many different ways. And this is why I think it's been cool to deliver a lot of the education we did this year. And I think this episode, as much as it might still be a bit confusing, I think we can clock back to some of those episodes. If you haven't listened to those, it'd be episodes 110 to 115-ish. We spoke a lot about training and the process of training. So you can kind of clock back to those and go oh yeah, that's starting to piece together with this. Another thing that can obviously play a factor in this is hormones. So we'll speak about that a little bit more, I think, in the second episode, but that's more of a genetic thing, unless you're, supplementing with hormones. But we're not going to get into steroid chat or anything like that today. But obviously if people have, different testosterone levels and stuff, that's going to affect mass. Okay, so there's a lot of info in there, and we're going to come back to some of that, but we are going to move on to the next thing. And this episode is going to keep sort of going back and forth like that. But the next thing I want to speak about, and it breaks down sort of into two categories, is muscle protein turnover. And you might not have heard of this, but you might have heard of muscle protein synthesis. And if you haven't, that's totally fine. I'm about to explain the shit out of it. But you might have heard it and sort of been like, oh, I kind of get that, but I don't really fully get that. I think that's really common. But if we come back to that term muscle protein turnover, there's two things in that turnover process. Muscle protein synthesis is one of them, and muscle protein breakdown is one of them. And this is where it's important to understand and think about protein in terms of muscle protein, not like protein powder and how much protein is in my food. So if we think about this, it can be a bit of a mouthful and a bit of an overload, but it can also make a lot of sense when you actually just look at the wording. Muscle protein breakdown is exactly what it sounds like. The muscle protein, if we think about the muscle, I feel like I just always grab my bicep and picture my bicep. So if you're watching on YouTube, I've got the bicep out. But if we think about muscle protein breakdown, and what we just spoke about with training and tearing those fibers, and it starts to break down, that's exactly what it sounds like, muscle protein breakdown. If we look at muscle protein synthesis, that's like the rebuild and the repair. And I'm going to read my notes on those things, and then I'm going to really explain them, like I said. So muscle protein turnover is a constant process of synthesis, in brackets building, and then breakdown. Muscle protein synthesis, which we call MPS, and I'm probably going to start referring to it as MPS because it's such a mouthful, is the process where your body uses amino acids from protein to repair and build new muscle tissue, particularly after exercise. So if we think about that, muscle protein synthesis, which is the building part of the muscle, is the process where your body uses protein or the amino acids from protein. So your body uses protein to repair and build new muscle tissue, particularly after exercise. So if we think about exercise having or being the muscle protein breakdown, because we're tearing those fibers, and I'm going to speak more about breakdown in a second, but we then go into the other stage of muscle protein turnover, which is muscle protein synthesis. And that's where the body starts drawing on protein to rebuild or repair and build new muscle tissue. And I'm going to read my notes on muscle protein synthesis, and then I'll keep trying to explain these things as best I can. But MPS is a metabolic process that incorporates amino acids into skeletal muscle proteins. Amino acids come from the protein in our food in this scenario. So we want to think about MPS is a process that basically takes the protein that we've consumed and starts using it towards building the skeletal muscle proteins, essentially building and repairing muscle tissue. MPS is crucial for muscle growth and recovery after exercise as it counteracts muscle protein breakdown that occurs during intense workouts. So I feel like I just kind of touched on that before. Obviously, we train, we start to, if we think about tearing those muscle fibers, we're breaking down that muscle. The muscle has muscle proteins in it. So we're breaking down that muscle protein. And then as we come out of that training session, the body's rolling through that muscle protein turnover cycle. It's just been through the muscle protein breakdown cycle. So now it starts to come into muscle protein synthesis, aka the repair and the building process. And then we want to make sure that we've got protein available in the body to assist with that process. And I don't want to get too off topic, but we can start to tie that right back to our initial points of the things that are cock-blocking muscle growth, shitty quality training, and not getting enough protein and energy into the body. If we think about that process right there where we train to break down the muscle fibers, obviously we want to make sure our training is good enough and hard enough to do that. And then if we think about coming into the next stage of that muscle building cycle, we want the sufficient protein and energy there to help with that. So this is where it all starts to piece together, if you're still with me. Back to my notes. So what we just said there was MPS is crucial for muscle growth and recovery after exercise as it counteracts muscle protein breakdown that occurs during workouts or during training. Exercise creates micro damage in the muscle fibers. Your body uses amino acids from protein to repair this damage and rebuild the muscle tissue. MPS is stimulated by resistance training and the consumption of protein. Optimal protein intake and timing are important for maximizing MPS. I feel like we've pretty much explained that, but if we really look at it, MPS is stimulated by resistance training and the consumption of protein. If we think about going through the breakdown process, the body's essentially in that turnover cycle, it's just ticked off breakdown. If you've just finished training, the body's just ticked off that breakdown, muscle protein breakdown part. It then wants to go into muscle protein synthesis because that's just the next part of the cycle, but it wants the resources there to do so. And in a second, I'm going to speak about what can happen if we have muscle protein breakdown happening and not muscle protein synthesis. And if we think about this, it might take you a few listens to all of this information before you can really just sort of visualize this and piece it together. But if we think about this muscle protein turnover happening, where we've got the breakdown and then the rebuild, aka the synthesis, essentially we need muscle protein synthesis to be greater or at least offset. If we want to gain muscle, we need it to be greater. If we want to maintain muscle, we need to offset the breakdown. So this is very simplified, and there's probably, experts out there that will butcher my wording of this. But if you're going through that breakdown process, you want to make sure you're offsetting it or matching it with the same amount, if not more, synthesis. So just think about going through that cycle. I break it down, I build it up. I break it down, I build it up. And then clock the fact that the building part of it needs protein and energy to do so. Right? And we'll keep coming back to these things, but I'll come back to my notes as well. So then a few dot point or summary things I had on the muscle protein synthesis was resistance training can stimulate muscle protein synthesis and is essential for muscle growth. I feel like that should be starting to make sense. Sufficient good quality protein coming in or consumption of good quality protein is obviously super important and vital for this process as well. Again, I feel like that should be starting to make sense. The timing of that protein can be important. Consuming protein around your workouts can optimize this. This is not life or death. We used to see people really harp on about this. As soon as you put your weights down, you should throw back a protein shake within 30 seconds. The body is not going through that process and then just being You just put the weights down. I need to start the MPS. Where's the protein? Like, if we think about the body, like if you've had protein earlier, if you've had protein prior to that workout, like the body's going to have protein coming and going at all times. So it's not just like, oh my God, I need it right this second. So we don't need to think about it like that. But obviously we want to think about having protein at some point around the workout. If we have it before and then the body has it available as soon as it starts that process. Obviously if we finish training and then we do have a shake, or we go home and we have a meal with like meat, yogurt, eggs, something like that, we're going to get it in and we're going to keep that turnover happening. So it's not life or death to the minute. It's more just like, I would just be going, have I had protein within 2 hours of the workout, either side, really. And as a little bit of a side note on that, guys, I'm going to do an episode in the next few weeks about more so like the macro breakdown and other things I'd be looking at, like when you're actually setting up your nutrition and your days of eating, factoring in all this information, because I feel like if we start to go too far into that, we actually will be here all day. But the last dot point I had for the MPS was rest and recovery. Sufficient rest and sleep are obviously super important in that repair and growth process as well. And again, I feel like we've kind of explained why that is. So that was our MPS. I am going to read the notes I had on muscle protein breakdown, but I feel like we've also started to really cover these as well. Muscle protein breakdown is a natural process where muscle tissue is broken down, releases amino acids that can then be used for energy or to build new proteins. I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. Muscle protein breakdown is a crucial part of building muscle and increasing muscle mass, occurring alongside the muscle protein synthesis. So obviously if we just have the breakdown, it's not going to help with building muscle mass. But when we look at the muscle protein turnover overall, obviously it's a huge part of that. And if we think about that turnover cycle, another note I had here is resistance training increases muscle protein breakdown, but it also increases muscle protein synthesis, leading to overall muscle growth if muscle protein synthesis is greater than muscle protein breakdown. So again, that can be confusing, but think about the cycle. We're breaking it down, we're building it back up, we're breaking it down, we're building it back up. If we go into the gym and we go through that breakdown process, then we come into that building process and we make sure the body's got protein to do so, it's got energy to do so, and it gets enough rest to do so, then that muscle protein synthesis is going to be optimized. It's going to be as good as it can be. So we've done the training, we've done the breakdown. We then go into the rebuild phase. And the cool thing to think about here is this can be such a light bulb moment for people that think the more they train, the better. And we've spoken about this a lot in those training episodes. And I think the people who get it are really starting to get it. But this can just be another thing to clock if you sort of do get stuck in that mindset of like, oh, well, surely the more I can go to gym, the better. And if I want to grow this muscle, surely I should just train it as much as I can. If we really think about that, that's essentially like saying I should break down this muscle as much as I can. If we think about the fact that the muscle growth happens in this whole turnover cycle, and a big part of the cycle is the rebuild, if you're just obsessed with the breakdown and you're doing more breakdown than rebuild, aka you've got more muscle protein breakdown happening than more muscle protein synthesis, the equation is off. So really cool thing to think about, and you might have to listen to this episode again to clock that. But if you really wanted to simplify this whole thing to understand it, I would essentially look at it like we've spoken about in so many other episodes. This is why I skim over it in this way in other episodes, because as we're starting to see here, there's a lot to get your head around when we look at it in depth. But the simplified version of this is when I train, I break down my muscle fibers. I then leave the gym. I make sure I get enough energy, I get enough protein in for those muscle fibers to rebuild and repair bigger, better, stronger. This is where my muscle growth happens. And then I go back and do it again. And then I do it again. And then I do it again. And we can start to piece this together with everything we talk about consistency over time, and the fact that muscle growth can take a long time, and the fact that we want to get enough protein, and the fact we want to make sure we have enough calories coming in, and we want to get enough rest, and we want to have smart, structured, progressive training in place. Everything we've spoken about this year is starting to make a lot more sense when we really look at the science and everything behind this. And I think it's cool to understand this science enough and do an episode like this. I think if I sat here every week and did this, you'd all probably leave. But I think it's important to explain this enough so that then when we do those other episodes where we summarize this stuff really quickly, you've got that underlying knowledge to go, oh yeah, I get that. And that's really cool. I think this is really cool. So it's definitely worth revisiting this stuff when you need to, and I'd probably do so a few times with an episode like this. And there's one more little thing I want to speak about here before I split into our second episode. But the note I had here, I'm going to read out this note. I just wrote this before. Muscle protein breakdown is essentially the protein/energy that is stored in the muscle being released for the body to use as energy. If we don't give the body enough energy, especially for a prolonged period of time, we can see muscle atrophy. Atrophy, first of all, people say that in all different ways, so you might say that a bit differently to me, but that's essentially losing muscle. If we think about muscle hypertrophy, that's the process of increasing muscle in the body. The atrophy is where we lose muscle. Muscle protein breakdown is the protein/energy that is stored in the muscle being released for the body to use as energy. If we don't give the body enough energy, especially for a prolonged period of time, we can see muscle atrophy, aka we can see the body start to use the muscle for energy. Let's just look at this for a second here. When we go through that breakdown process, the body, like I said there, is releasing the stored energy and protein in that muscle. When the muscle protein synthesis kicks in, it can draw from that energy and protein that it just released. This is very simplified. And then use it again to go back through the cycle, as well as using the protein that we've given the body, like new protein in the body. If we do not match the muscle protein synthesis with the muscle protein breakdown, like I said before, that breakdown is happening, the body's releasing that protein and the energy. If we don't match it and really optimize that muscle protein synthesis process, we're going to have the body, like we're saying here, releasing that protein and that energy, not rebuilding and reusing it and growing, and therefore we see the muscle atrophy, aka the muscle starts to degenerate and we lose muscle. The one little thing I want to intercept here with is I'm not going to speak today about like medical conditions or illnesses or anything where we can see muscle loss occur, because obviously we know there can be things in life where there's an actual medical condition going on and the body's using muscle and there's processes happening like that. I'm not going to touch on that at all because it's completely outside of my scope. It's not what I do. It's not what we're here to talk about. So when I speak about this, I'm speaking about it in terms of a person who's otherwise healthy, but then potentially when we're just looking at what they're doing with nutrition and training, we could see this process occur if we're not getting this turnover right and matching the breakdown with the rebuild. And if we come back to that note, what I really wanted to explain here is if we go through that process of breakdown and the body releases that energy and the protein, and then it's sort of looking to go through that rebuild process, if we don't have enough protein or enough energy in the system, it's very hard for the body to do that, and the body's not going to do that. And I want to use a little bit of an extreme example to explain this, but then we can just bring this back to someone who's either always dieting, always pursuing fat loss, overtraining, like really on the grind in that breakdown process, but then not giving much when it comes to the rebuild and the repair process. If we think about somebody, I've used this example before for a few different scenarios, but I think it's really cool to use here. If someone was to find themselves on a deserted island, right? And there's absolutely no food. I'll use myself as an example. If I found myself on a deserted island and had absolutely no food, if we think about the fact that the body needs a certain amount of energy just to survive and go through its processes every day. We spoke about this really early in the year. If you don't understand this, I'd go back to episode 106 because we really explained it in there. But the energy or the calories that the body uses to just stay alive and get through the day before we even factor in any movement is called our BMR, our basal metabolic rate. And it's essentially like your metabolism. It's just the energy that your body needs to function and be alive. If you think about someone being on a deserted island, they need that energy, right? If you want to stay alive, your body needs a certain amount of energy to just do its thing for the day, even if you're not moving. This number is going to be a little bit different from person to person because it depends on like size, age, height, weight, gender, a few other things. So for myself, like I said, I'll use myself as an example. My BMI is around 1300. This means my body needs 1300 calories of energy every day to just do its thing before I even factor in any movement. The reason I'm explaining this and the thing we want to think about here is if I'm on a deserted island in a situation where I'm not getting any food, but my body's using 1300 calories, right? We get calories from food. If there's no food coming in, the body still needs that amount. So the body goes, where can I get this from? Like we've spoken about on the podcast over the months and years, body fat is stored energy. So if your body doesn't get enough energy through food and drink, it can look in your body and go, where can I get some energy, right? It can pull energy out of storage, aka body fat. If we think about everything I've just spoken about today, muscle also holds stored energy. So if you're in a scenario where there's a really reduced amount of energy coming in and the body's looking for it in storage, it can pull it from body fat, it can pull it from muscle. And I'll skip ahead a little bit for a second here. If we think about a person intentionally going into an energy deficit, aka intentionally giving their body less energy than it needs to make it use some of that stored body fat and achieve fat loss. This is literally how fat loss is achieved, if you don't know. We've spoken about this a lot, but if you're new here, that is literally how fat loss is achieved. If you're doing that intentionally in a controlled, moderate way, there's also things that you can do to make sure the body uses as much of or gets as much of its energy from stored body fat instead of stored muscle. If we bring it back to the big convo we've just had about the muscle protein turnover, if we're doing everything we can to optimize that process, aka we're training hard, the muscles break down, the muscles then draw on protein. So we've given the body enough protein to actually go through that MPS and the rebuild and everything. While we've got an energy deficit in place, we're doing everything we can to optimize the body using stored energy in the form of body fat, not muscle, because we're doing everything we can over here in that cycle to keep the muscle protein synthesis occurring as best it can during a deficit, right? If you don't understand that, you'll definitely need to go back and listen to the last 3 months of the podcast, because that can be a lot. But there could be people sitting there going, well, if I go into a deficit intentionally, but the body could use muscle or body fat, how do I know what's going on there? This is where we want to look and go, okay, well, if I know there's things I can do to optimize maintaining or building muscle, I'll do those things while I've got my deficit in place, right? So that's a bit of a separate topic, but I just feel like a few people's minds would have gone there because it's like, if my body can use both, what if it's using the muscle? That's kind of what I want to speak about. We're almost starting to kind of go in a loop here, but we want to understand that breakdown and the rebuild process so we can make sure we're optimizing that as much as we can all the time. Obviously, if the goal is muscle growth and we're not pursuing fat loss or anything, like if we're really wanting to get after building shape, building muscle, we want to make sure we've got that process in place and we're killing it with that. If we are pursuing fat loss, we still want to make sure we've got that process in place and we're killing it with that so we can maintain the muscle and have the body draw from its body fat stores when it realizes it's deficient in energy. So I'm about to wrap up this episode before I get into part 2 of this convo, but the thing I kind of wanted to get across there and the last little thing I wanted to include in this episode is just understanding what's going on there, where the body is holding a form of energy in the muscle. It's obviously holding energy in the form of stored body fat. And we want to understand these things and we want to start to understand this muscle protein turnover process so that we can kind of piece all that together. And I know I haven't answered the question of do I need a surplus to gain muscle, but I feel like I'm definitely going to speak more about that in the next episode. And I just feel like it's important to kind of understand the rest of this first and start to piece it together. And the last little thing, obviously, like I said before, that deserted island scenario is quite an extreme example. But if we bring that back to a person who maybe is just under-consuming, over-contraining, or having prolonged periods of these things, it's really common to see people really get after it in the gym and like you're at the gym all the time and you're on that grind all the time and you're always, quote, dieting. And maybe you understand this stuff, maybe you don't, but your dieting is quite low calorie, your training is quite intense. If we really step back and think about everything we've spoken about, this is where we can often see people, and I don't say this to be rude or disrespectful, but this is where we can see people that are quite scrawny and skinny and there's not a lot of muscle mass. There's not a lot of body fat, but there's not a lot of muscle mass. If we think about this process and everything we've just spoken about, if there's a lot of this breakdown happening because this person trains a lot, but there's not a lot of the rebuild and repair happening as well, then that equation isn't going to add up in our favor. If we come back to one of the notes I said a while ago, resistance exercise increases muscle protein breakdown, but it also increases muscle protein synthesis, leading to overall muscle growth. And what I mean by there is it increases muscle protein synthesis because once we've gone through the breakdown, the next part of the cycle is the synthesis. So the training officiates the breakdown, if you will, and then the body essentially is at the point where it goes, okay, I'm ready to go into muscle protein synthesis and rebuild and repair if we then give it what it needs to do so. So Resistance training is going to increase the breakdown, but it is also going to increase the body wanting to go into muscle protein synthesis. And then the next thing I had in the note was leading to overall muscle growth if MPS is greater than MPB. So essentially saying if the energy and the protein and the recovery that the body gets is good enough to match or beat the breakdown. And really think about that. The last thing I'll say here is the breakdown is training. So if we've given it our all in training, we've done a wicked training sesh, we've ticked off the breakdown part, the body needs us to tick off the rebuild part just as much, if not more, if we want to grow or at least maintain muscle. I think that is a perfect place to cap this episode. If you are still here, massive shout out to you because that was a lot. But I definitely think listen a few times. I'm going to go straight into episode number 2 while it's all fresh in my brain. And I think if you listen to both and you start to get your head around all of this stuff, really, really cool. And just know, like I said at the start, it might take a while to get your head around it. Let that be okay, because the more you hear it, the more you do. And what I'll say there, guys, is I'm someone that studied this stuff. And this is something that I've gone over so many times in the years, because you're just like, yeah, that happens and that happens. That's doing that. That's over there. Like there's so many factors. And we then have to move into the fact that there's factors of just being an everyday human being as well. Yes, the body is a science thing and it's going through its processes, but I'm also out here living my life at the same time. How does all of that line up? And that's exactly what I'm going to speak about in the next episode. So I know I've hit you guys with so much information and facts in this one, but definitely come back for episode 2. I will lay off the confusing factual chat and I'm going to speak more about what we can actually do with those facts. If we are someone who wants to maintain muscle, grow some muscle, build our shape, tone up, or any of those things, the next episode is for you. Thank you so much.